So welcome back, and we'd like to again welcome the people viewing across the globe by internet, by live stream video. And so we have a wonderful presentation coming up, the second presentation of Dr. Robert Schoch. What an amazing man, what an amazing work. Just prepare yourselves for another wonderful presentation on Easter Island. It is entitled Solar Outburst in the End of the Last Ice Age. So a warm Earthkeeper welcome for Dr. Robert Schoch.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, let's make sure that the microphone is working. Is that working now? Okay, very, very good. And I think we'll have the lights down to the appropriate level. And what I want to do now, this is a second talk. So a few of you did not make my first talk. And I know it's been very busy and some people came in late, that type of thing. But I will have this a standalone talk, even though I'm continuing some issues, and sort of in the middle, I will review a few pertinent points from the first talk. So those that were here, you'll be familiar with it, but it's always good to review. I teach at Boston University, and I know from students that it's always good to review, right? Especially if you're having an exam. Which you all are. It's the exam of life, correct? Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk about Easter Island. Easter Island is very special to me and Katie, my wife, for a couple of different reasons. We just love the island, but it's also been instrumental in the research. And if you've read my book, you know that is special to us for another reason, and that is, in fact, we were married there. So, yeah, so it is very special to us. So we'll start by just having a little introduction to Easter Island. And Easter Island is sometimes known as, it goes by various names. Why is it called Easter Island? Because it was discovered by the Western world on Easter Sunday. It's sometimes known as Te Pita Te Henua, and that basically translates as the navel of the world. Or you can think of it as the beginning, the origin place. Now, lots of places think of themselves as the beginning or the origin, but in the case of Easter Island, I think this really does have significance, and we'll come to that. Easter Island is located in the South Pacific. It is sometimes referred to as the most remote inhabited location on Earth. It really is isolated. It's a tiny little island. This is as we were flying in on our first trip to Easter Island, looking at it from the airplane. It's about 2,000 kilometers from any other inhabited land, and the indigenous people were isolated, I believe, for effectively thousands of years on this tiny but beautiful island. The island became known to the Western world first when the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen spotted it on Easter Sunday in 1722. So that's where we get the name Easter Island. And it is known, and this is a very early painting, known for the big heads and torsos, the Moai. That I'm sure everyone has seen pictures of Moai. If you haven't been to Easter Island yourself, that's what it's best known for. And these Moai circle the coast of Easter Island. Here I have tens of thousands of mysteries. That is not an exaggeration. Easter Island is packed with archaeological sites, some small, some large. It's literally a treasure trove of ancient history, and I believe has not been fully explored, not been fully understood to this day. But just to give you a little sort of overview of the island for those that haven't been there. Has anyone been to, some of you have been to Easter Island, I know, because James was telling me that there was a trip there. But this is one of the complexes, the Ahu Tahi complex. And the Ahu Those are these bases, and on them, the Moai. So this is some of the Moai on the Ahu. And something that a lot of people who have not been to Easter Island, they have a misconception. They think of the Moai as looking out to the ocean. No, their backs are to the ocean. They look inland. They look toward the center of the island, effectively. And they sit on these these Ahus, which are artificially constructed, ancient artificial constructions. These Moai are actually incredible in terms of scale and size. The erected ones that stand on some of the Ahus are up to 10 meters tall, 75 tons in weight. There's actually an unfinished Moai, I'll show you a picture of it later, that's still lying in the quarry, and it's 21 meters long and has an estimated weight of 250 tons. So, I mean, think about what they were doing, or what they had planned to do. Just some pictures to give you a sense of it. Really, I can't say this enough, it's just a gorgeous island. These are actually quite sophisticated. These are all ancient structures that were built to hold back the ocean, if you would, to stabilize the coast. More pictures. All of these on the Ahus originally had eyes, but their eyes have since been removed. In fact, all these Moai, they were standing in 1722. But between 1722 and the end of the 19th century, about 1900, they were all knocked down. What happened when the Europeans got there? Civil strife started to break up the island. What happens when Europeans meet indigenous people? You know, it usually goes downhill for the indigenous people. Diseases, there were slave raids on Easter Island, you know, where Europeans came and literally took huge proportions of the population. You know, at one point, the Easter Island population was down to 111 from an estimated maybe 6,000 or so. So, you know, horrible decimation of the people and their culture at the hands of the Westerners, the Europeans, basically. So it's a very sad story, the modern history of Easter Island. But since then, the Moai have been re-erected, and this is one of the examples where eyes were put back into the head. And if you look at the eyes, and I have looked at this very carefully because it ties in with the story and the work I've been doing, which I'll get to, the eyes, do you see, they're actually looking up. So they're looking up toward the sky, and that's an important point to remember. This is Katie, my wife, who many of you have met already. And of course, well, I say of course, but I'll say it now. She took many of these photographs. I would say virtually all of them. Again, these Moai, and some of them have people called a hat or a top knot. People vary as to what the interpretation is, or is it symbolic? We can come back to that. And you see many of them are missing it now. These probably all had the top knots or the headdress on them. Just give you a sense of the coast. And this is interesting. What you have here, you could call it a jetty, but it's a volcanic island, so most of these Moai are made out of volcanic tuff stones, or tufa stones, not basalt, a bit softer rock, and that's an important point we'll come back to, but still not trivial to carve a Moai that weighs, 75 tons or more. But they also built, it may not look so impressive, but they built these seawalls and they built these jetty-type features going out into the ocean. So there's some real sophistication here, and they also worked with the natural structures. It's a volcanic island, as I said. It has 3 calderas, 3 corners of the island. I'm a geologist, so I like these types of things. And they're very beautiful. This is the caldera. It is considered, quote, extinct volcano from a human perspective. What does that mean? It's been some thousands of years since it's erupted. From a geological perspective, as far as I'm concerned, it could potentially erupt again. There's a couple more views of it, and there is Katie and I standing at the edge of this caldera. Here's another one of the ahus with the Moai. I show this one. This is one of the most impressive ones. There we're going up to it. This is an isolated Moai with myself for scale. It's a fairly small one, all things considered. And this is Tangariki. And to give you a little sense of it, look at them. We showed this picture to someone, and he asked, was it photoshopped? No, it's not photoshopped. And notice the two people on the lower left for scale. Actually, I'm that person right there. Can you tell? But really, you have to experience it. And yeah, it's just huge. And what were they doing this for? That's another question. Well, we'll come to that. And because most people take pictures from the front, this is what it looks like from behind. And aren't they cute? All lined up there. Here's a wedding shot. Yeah, this was our wedding day with the Moai. Now, where did these Moai come from? They were quarried. Most of the Moai that we know, as I said, they were coming out the volcanic, it's a tufa rock. I won't get into a lot of geology, but it's the volcanic rock that's found there. This is really the major quarry for it. And do you see them all there? Do you see them sticking up? Those are the little heads. There's a number that are erected to this day right at the quarry. They're still at the quarry site, but they were put up. That more or less they were built or they were carved lying essentially on their backs, and then they were raised vertically. Do you see some of their heads popping up now? And this is one lying on his back. He wasn't fully quarried. He's left partially quarried. And we're going to get closer. And here we're in the quarry, and you can see, you can walk around here, and they're just all over the place. It's like a forest of Moai. And there's the front and the back of the same one. Katie and I standing in front of it. And here, notice the long ears. Do you see the long ears? Long extended ears. I think you can see it there too. This one's starting to fall over a little bit, but most of them are standing vertically, and they've remained vertical. That's actually another important point that I will get to. And look at this one. This is sort of unusual. It says reuse or a totem pole, but do you see how this is a body here? This was a head originally, and then that head seems to have been recarved as a body and another smaller head. So use and reuse are at least different stages of use. So let's talk about the interpretations a little bit, some of the work that's been done. Have people heard of Thor Heyerdahl? Yeah, I think so. Most people have heard of him, the late Thor Heyerdahl. He was a famous explorer, a famous discoverer, scientist, and he became very famous for reconstructing, for instance, transoceanic voyages. And he demonstrated how with, quote, primitive, and I would say it's not quite so primitive, technology, for instance, indigenous boats versus, what are generally called rafts, but they're not rafts in a primitive sense. He did the classic Kon-Tiki and traveled across the Pacific. He had the Ra and the Ra-2, which he was able to traverse the Atlantic. Those were reed boats, very much like the reed boats that we see that the Sumerians and the Egyptians had. And he demonstrated how these, quote, primitive vessels, in fact, were incredibly seaworthy, how these, quote, primitive people could use very advanced navigational techniques and cross the oceans. And that's something I've been very interested in for a number of years. I actually wrote a book some years ago called Voyages of the Pyramid Builders, where I talk about the evidence, including the evidence developed by Thor Heyerdahl, that in very ancient times, people were traveling around the world and passing on information, passing on physical goods in some case. But that's another story. But how does it tie in with Easter Island? Thor Heyerdahl was very interested in Easter Island to the point that in the 1950s, he actually went to Easter Island with his crew, with an expedition, and did a lot of research on Easter Island and remained interested in Easter Island as one of his research projects until his death in 2002. This is not Thor Heyerdahl, but this is one of his members of his staff and crew, and these are other members. This is on Easter Island. I don't know how he did this, but they found and excavated this Moai, which if you look at, doesn't that look different than the ones I showed you? It's very anomalous, but it's there on Easter Island. There's no question that it's a real Moai on Easter Island. They excavated it. It's right in the same quarry. You can now see it. These are photographs that Katie took of it, and it's very different. Remember I mentioned the long ears? Most of them are long ears. They're the heads, the torso standing erect with the arms and the hands down to the navel. Look at this guy. He has short ears, very different face, very, very different physique, and he's kneeling. He has legs. The classic Moai don't have legs below essentially the waist genital region. They're just torsos and heads with arms. So this is a very different, anomalous Moai. There's another picture of it. And Thor Heyerdahl, and I agree, because when I saw it first, I said immediately the same thing, that this looks very similar to things that we find, for instance, in Tiwanaku and La Paz in Peru. That very, very similar iconography, very similar type of structure. And he had the gall to suggest that maybe there were South American connections to Easter Island, even though it's couple of thousand kilometers away. And this was heretical, essentially, because most classical scholars, this is the party line, this is the paradigm, that Easter Island is part of larger Polynesia, that the Polynesians were moving from the west to the east, and the last island they inhabited or colonized was Easter Island, that they did this at a very late date, as late as maybe 500 or slightly later AD, so Easter Island has only been inhabited for about 1,500 years. And I think that paradigm is wrong. That's the bottom line. And I'll show you more evidence for that. One of the aspects is that maybe there are not just connections to the west of Easter Island in Polynesia, but also maybe to the east with South America. Another point with maybe a South American connection, and Thor Heyerdahl pointed this out too. This is on Easter Island, Ahu Vinipu. You see the finely dressed blocks of stone? Very beautiful. Does that remind you of anything? Yes, in Peru, I'm sure. For instance, Sacsayhuaman in Peru, this is myself a few years ago when I was visiting there, and they are, I would say, most people would say, unless you have a paradigm that you want to uphold, and not look at, in my opinion, pretty straightforward evidence. These are very, very clear. Now, certain conventional scholars will say, no, they have nothing to do with each other. But I think stylistically, they're very similar when you combine this, for instance, with the kneeling Moai and other evidence I won't get into here. The very strong argument can be made that there are connections with South America. I'm not denying that there are connections to the West too. In fact, I'll say it right now, I wouldn't be surprised if Easter Island turned out to be a point of origin and there was spread from Easter Island both east and west and interchange interconnections at a very, very early age. Here is back to the quarry. Look at the size of that. Yeah, that's just the head. This is an unfinished one. Here we're discussing how they were carved and why they were carved. This is a former archaeologist and former governor of Easter Island. And I'm not don't want to make fun of anyone, but the classic explanation of why the Moai were carved on this little island is summarized in 2 words: busy work. Well, look, think about it. Isn't it logical? It was a small island, a lot of people on this island. You know, to keep everyone occupied and happy, they didn't have television, so you have to do something to, so they said busy work, carve these incredible statues and erect them, and when you're done, carve another one that keeps everyone employed and occupied. And they don't think about revolting against you if you're the chief or whatever. Now, that's a standard explanation, which, really, in my opinion, is not very satisfying. That's simply busy work. I don't think you go through this effort and spend that amount of time without there being some real significance behind it. Here's another picture, just a close-up. Look at this one. I have to point it out. Do you see the Moai there? Look at the scale, and part of it is buried underneath there, but it was, again, not completed, but this one, the best estimate is about 21 meters long and weighed, or if it had been completed, would have weighed about 250 tons. I mean, imagine that. So Easter Island, on Easter Island, okay, remember the Moai? This is a Moai with long ears. Most of them have long ears. There was a legend. There's an indigenous legend or tradition that Easter Island had 2 races on it. Maybe these were probably races that, independent landings, people coming to the island. But there were the giants, the so-called giants or long ears, and then there were the normal-sized people or the short ears. So 2 different, if you want to call it races or groups or ethnicities. Could this really have been the case? Of course, the standard traditional explanation is, guess what? No, that it's just, sort of a myth. They weren't literally 2 races. There weren't literally giants on Easter Island. But we do have the Moai, the giant Moai with the long ears, and then a few anomalies like that little kneeling Moai. We also have here from the earliest explorers, and what I'm going to show you next is recorded in the Smithsonian Institution's archives back from the 19th century. The Smithsonian sponsored, among other things, an expedition to Easter Island in the late 19th century, collected a lot of data and also looked at earlier expeditions. And one thing they noted, and this is from their archives, is that the Berens, he was one of the early explorers. He was actually with Roggeveen when they first discovered the island in 1722, and he said very explicitly that some of the men on Easter Island at that time were 12 feet tall. That there were some were normal size, but some were 12 feet in height, and that, in fact, the tallest men, the Dutch, and are the Dutch short? The Dutch are not known for being short. But some of the men on board the ship, some of the Europeans, could actually pass between the legs of these children of Goliath, as he called them, without bending their heads. Now, I asked one of the archaeologists working on Easter Island, what does he make of this story? Were there really giants in the early 18th century, a few relic giants on Easter Island? And he said, of course, though, that's all nonsense. They were simply standing on stilts. Now, I think that, people, the Dutch, I have a partly Dutch ancestry, and I don't think my ancestors were stupid enough to mistake someone standing on stilts for a genuine 12-foot person. And also, if you read it, he talks about them rowing out to the ships, etc. That would be hard to do standing on stilts. So could there be a relic population of giants that maybe survived? There are also reports, Katie and I talked to people who said, first-hand accounts, that they had seen giant bones in some of the caves on Easter Island. So I just put that out there as a possibility. We talked about giants. Other people have talked about giants earlier during the conference. I do want to point out that the Dutch not only spoke about giants on Easter Island, they spoke about something else that you've already heard about in one of the previous talks, and that is little people on very small islands in Indonesia, because the Dutch were trading in Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, and they discussed in was now modern Indonesia, Java, and Sumatra, and the islands associated with it. They said that as they were trading with indigenous people, the indigenous people would talk about little people, which the Dutch did not see directly, but little people that lived up in the mountains would come down and sometimes raid the villages, steal the babies, that type of thing. And of course, the Dutch didn't really know what to make of this. Modern anthropologists and researchers have generally done what? Dismissed these stories as, again, nonsensical. But in 2004, the species, a new species was discovered, Homo floresiensis. In fact, I remember this vividly, wasn't that long ago, only 10 years ago. Some people in the scientific literature, they claimed that this was supposed to be a hoax. Other people said it was just a malformed individual. Comes from Indonesia about 18,000 years ago. After the first specimen was found, more were found. Here's this skull compared to a modern human skull. It turns out that Homo floresiensis, there's no doubt in researchers' minds now, was a distinct species of human, a diminutive species of human. And this is the way National Geographic described it. A male Homo floresiensis returns from the hunt. Found on the island of Flores in Indonesia, these ancient humans grew no taller than a 3-year-old modern human child. So imagine that, how big a modern 3-year-old is, but these were adults. Their small size led scientists to nickname the species hobbits, after the tiny Lord of the Rings characters. The first such individual was found was female. Since then, at least 7 individuals have been found, including males. Initially, when you find one individual, yes, you can maybe make a case that's pathological and not representative of a race of small individuals, but even more have been found since then. And some of these go back to at least as recent as 13,000 years ago. Is it conceivable that they were still alive in the 18th and 19th century? I think that's a possibility, and that the Dutch were reporting, real accounts. If that's the case for Homo floresiensis, couldn't that be the case for Easter Island and around the world, some of these other reports of giants that we have? So I just put that out there. At any rate, other things that we have on Easter Island are, for instance, the island's mysterious caves, and when Katie and I were there on our last trip, unsolicited, one of the natives of Easter Island, and when I say natives, there are no full-blooded Easter Islanders at this point because there's been so much intermixing, intermarriage with Europeans. But someone who still had an ancestry going back just offered that, yes, the tradition is that they had to live in these caves at times for, he said, thousands of years because conditions on the surface were, very harsh and not easily, livable. So they had to retreat to these caves. Keep that in mind. as I develop the work here. But here's one of the cave entrances. This is a fairly big cave entrance. Others are very narrow. Here I'm going into one. They consist primarily of lava tubes. Remember, it's a volcanic island, lava tubes, but do you see how he's sitting on a ledge here? These were built up. They found skeletons in some of them. Clearly, the evidence indicates that these were inhabited. Here we're in one, there we're going through one, there's Katie in one of the caves, and I think, can you see me poking through, looking through? And there is one of the larger entrances. Actually, this is on the edge of the water, so part of this now has eroded away in recent times. But some of the cave entrances are very, very small. I'm coming out of one here. I could barely fit through. And not only are there caves, but there are these other strange structures. And again, keep these in mind. These unusual, we'll call them houses or shelters. This is a Rongo village. What do they look like? Don't they almost look like bunkers or fallout shelters? I mean, they're very low. The Easter Islanders were not small people, even the normal size, much less potentially 12-foot Easter Islanders. Yet these are very thick, very low, just have these little entrance ways to them. And there you can see one of them. Standard explanation is, things like they were used to protect themselves from their enemies during times of warfare. Now, how is that going to protect you from your enemy? You go in there, your enemy comes along, and they just keep you from coming out. And you starve to death. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Or if your enemy doesn't want to wait for you to starve to death, these are not mortared or anything. They just start pulling it apart. And then what do they call it? Spearing fish in a barrel or something, whatever the saying is. I mean, it's a death trap if it's to protect yourself from your enemies. Not if it's to protect yourself, for instance, maybe something coming down from the sky, like a solar outburst, which I'll get to. There's another view of it. It's just a fascinating thing. There's another view. Now, in this, and tying in with my theory that you're protecting yourself from not enemies, but natural elements, catastrophes that are coming from the sky, in this, at Orongo, was found, and it was found, and in the context, it had not originally been in there, but must have been put in there for safekeeping. So being put in there, essentially think of when you have an ancient relic that you want to protect, was found this Moai. This Moai is no longer on Easter Island. The British Museum decided that it should be taken there for safekeeping in the 19th century. More or less, they stole it. So it's now in the British Museum. It's not very big as far as Moai go. It's a bit bigger than me, but it's very interesting because it's carved out of basalt. So it's carved out of much harder rock than most of the Moai. They're carved out of a more porous volcanic rock. This is carved out of very hard basalt. And if you look at it, do you see how beautifully carved it is? It's meticulously carved. It's perhaps one of the most beautiful Moai in terms of technical finesse carving. It's got carvings on the back. These may be later carvings that were added to it, but it's incredibly beautiful, and it seems to be older than the majority of other Moai. Again, it was reused. It seems to have been sort of valued a higher, more than the other Moai. It was found in the context of being protected in one of these little, we'll call it houses or shelters at Orongo on Easter Island. To get it out, the British had to pull the whole thing apart, the shelter around it, and take it out with a huge crew of men, and took it back to the British Museum. Here is one in context. This is a pre-1924 photograph. And do you see the Moai there? He was reused. This is another basalt moai reused in an ahu, and they're missing now, but there would have been more big moai on top. But the fact that it's reused shows that he is older than the other moai. Again, these basalt moai, they're very rare, they're very well carved, and they're older than the other moai. Here's a really strange little basalt moai, referred to as female. You see her breasts? And look at her face, and what's going on here? Very, very strange. She's not that big. You'll see her with People for Scale in a second, but she's very strange, I think very beautiful. She's now in the museum at Easter Island. She was found in 2 pieces at 2 different times. Her body was found in the sand at Anaquina. That is the only sandy beach on Easter Island. So found very deep in the sand, her body was found. And then later, Thor Heyerdahl and his group found her head under one of the ahu walls, deep under the ahu wall. He was excavating and sure enough finds her head. Again, this indicates that she is much older. She's found very deep, found in context that indicates she's much older. So she was put back together and is now in the small museum, small but very beautiful quality exhibitions on Easter Island. So there she is. And what I think is going on is that these basalt moai, as I said, are not only older, but incredibly older. Something that is a real mystery on Easter Island, and something that I'm hoping to get back to Easter Island again and to carry out, very solid scientific research, is to figure out where these moai are coming from. Because these basalt quarries, there must have been basalt quarries where these moai were carved, yet they have never been found on the island. Easter Island is not a very big island. You can literally walk around the perimeter of Easter Island in 2 days, just a casual walk. That's how small it is. So if the basalt quarries have never been found, geologically, I expect that they're actually lower than the other quarries that I showed you, stratigraphically or topographically. That's what the geology would suggest, that they're lower geographically. So that means they must be lower. They're off the coast of the current island. But Easter Island, back in the Ice Age, or pre-Ice Age, back before about 10,000 BC, it would have been much larger. Why? Because sea levels were lower by 100 meters or more. So in fact, if we can find off the coast of Easter Island the basalt quarries, do you see the implications? That would indicate they were being quarried and worked 10,000 or more years ago, which would really throw a monkey wrench in the standard chronology. Does everyone see where I'm coming from? Yeah, and I think we've already got half the case made because, it's not a big island. You should be able to find where these things were quarried if they were quarried on the current island. Here's another thing that's going on. On Easter Island, you have these Birdman Petroglyphs. Can you see them there? Yeah. This ties in with the Birdman competition, which is part of the late history, we'll call it, of Easter Island. They don't do this anymore, but this is some old photographs. These are some of the same rocks, and here the petroglyphs have been chalked in so you can see them. You see the Birdman? Okay, remember the concept of the Birdman motif. Here he is, the bird or the bird human form holding an egg. Go back to a photograph that Katie took. Can you see that nicely? See the Birdman? Yeah. And they had a tradition in the 19th century. It lasted basically up until the time when the island was 100% Christianized in the mid-19th century, that they would have a competition where every year migratory birds would come to Easter Island. They would land and they would nest on this little islet, little mini island off the coast of Easter Island, these little islands. They would have a competition among the different tribes, we'll call it tribes or clans on Easter Island, where they would go and they would swim through these waters, which are quite shark infested and whatnot. This is no mean experience. This is not something you can do very simply. And they would go, and there was a competition to go and get the first egg and bring it back without breaking it. So the Birdman competitions, and that would determine, you know, sort of a power structure for the coming year. But I believe this competition really was a recollection of something more important in terms of a theme of a, quote, bird man. Do we see birdmen around the world in different cultures? Sure, you think of it in Egypt, you think of it around the world, and we'll come back to that. Here's another picture of one of the birdmen, or a petroglyph. We were hearing about petroglyphs earlier today, if you attended some of the talks. There's a early 20th century picture, another one. See him with his hand, and there's another one. So a lot of strange things on Easter Island. And another picture or so. Something else that's on Easter Island is this indigenous script. This is known as the Rongorongo script. It's one of the great mysteries of Easter Island and Polynesia, if you think of Easter Island as part of Polynesia, because none of the other islands in the Pacific had their own indigenous script. And this is a fairly complex, sort of hieroglyphic type script. Classic linguists to this day have not been able to interpret it or make much sense out of it. So it's really one of the great mysteries, and I believe that ties in with the story that I'm going to piece together in a few minutes, and it's actually one of the major clues as to what was happening to these early cultures at the end of the last ice age. So these are Rongorongo tablets. They're carved on wood. The tablets themselves are not necessarily that old, maybe just a couple of hundred years old, but I believe, and all the traditions say, that they are recording early texts, things that were passed down, copied again. Just for instance, like biblical texts or Plato, we don't have the original copies. In fact, much of Plato, the oldest we have is maybe 1000 AD, even though Plato lived back 2400 years ago. Here's a modern rendition of the Rongorongo outside of the mayor's office. Do you see it there? Yeah, I mean, it's blown up, obviously. This doesn't seem to work now. Oh, there we go. So there's the Rongorongo modern rendition. Also, I mentioned the island is called the navel of the world. Well, not only is the island called the navel of the world, but at Anaquina, this is Anaquina, on the beach there is a stone, that particular stone, Katie in her wedding dress. That particular stone, legend has it, that is the navel. That's the navel stone, and legend has it that this is not indigenous to Easter Island, that this was brought to Easter Island by the early settlers. Now, theoretically, you should be able to tell that by looking at the lithology, that is the specifics of the type of stone. I was certainly tempted to just whack off a piece for analysis, but I think if I had done that, I might be in a Chilean prison at the moment. They are actually so strict, depending on when you go there and how they're feeling at the time. On one of our trips, not us personally, but everyone, they searched everyone's bags to see if you even had a little piece of rock. Because it's such a small island, it's got so many antiquities, they don't want you touching anything. I don't know if you heard about it. Someone got in a lot of trouble for trying to knock off a piece of one of the Moai as a souvenir. I mean, major crime. I think it was a Japanese tourist, but don't quote me on that. No, I'm serious. So before we put everything together, just a few more sort of pictures of the tour of Easter Island. This is the only real beach, sandy beach on Easter Island, Anakina, very, very beautiful. These are all newly planted, relatively newly planted palm trees, because Easter Island, by the 19th century, let me put it that way, it was just decimated. Plant life, the human population, never was that much animal life on the island. It's a very remote place. Fairly treeless. Here is, again, that navel stone without people in the picture. These, I don't know that those are ancient, but this is the one that is traditionally the ancient navel. Here's Anakina in 2010. Now look at this picture. This is Thor Heyerdahl again. You recognize from the last slide? But look what he was allowed to do in 1980s. He did excavations there, and look at what he found. Well deep underneath, another wall, and look at those blocks. See how finely carved they are, how finely dressed they are, and being deep underneath, they are much older. Something's going on here. Unfortunately, to my satisfaction, these were never properly studied, and since then, this has all been filled back in again. Why would you do that? Are they trying to cover something up? Don't they want to know the true history of their island? Here's a back at Anakina, the Moai and the Ahu, and I just show this to you because this has been reconstructed in the 20th century. All of these got knocked down when there was strife on the island in the 19th century. Here's a little picture when they were just blocks in the sand on the beach. But do you see how this is this one here with the carving on it? Something I'm very interested in as far as trying to date and get a handle on this is geologic changes, things like sedimentation rates, erosion rates. So part of my research I'm now collecting as old photos as I can. So for instance, this was published in 1957, so pre-1957 photograph. This is one that we took in 2010. Do you see much difference? Aren't they very close? Yeah, more or less. It's not a situation where we're building up a lot of sediment, and the last was that 53 years, that type of thing. It's been very stable. Here is a pre-1924 photograph. Do you see the navel there? Versus 2010. And again, I'm analyzing things like this for any changes. Katie sometimes says, why do I take so many pictures? Because I take a lot of pictures. She takes the good pictures, but I just take pictures. So I'm taking pictures like crazy out the window as we're driving by things. And one picture I caught was of this hill on Easter Island. And then later, going through archives, I found this from 1946. Do you see that's the same hill? And this allows me now to analyze erosion rates from 1946 to 2010, and bottom line is there's virtually no change. These are slightly different angles, so you take that into account, virtually no change. So it's very, very stable. And this is important geologically because you look at something like this. Okay, this is a Moai. Do you see them there? A lot of these guys have been buried up to their chins, up to their shoulders, their chins, their necks, in sand, sediment, I should say. When you excavate them, this was excavated around World War I period, early 20th century. You excavate them, and they have full torsos and arms. This one was excavated by Thor Heyerdahl. He got permission to do that. Look how deep it is. How much sediment built up. That does not happen overnight. That, I would contend, does not happen in a mere 1,500 years. you're talking thousands and thousands of years, I believe, by natural sedimentation rates. And I've looked at this closely. I don't believe for a second that they were digging holes and just dumping them into holes, you know, and then burying them again. Unless, well, I guess if you buy the busy work argument, that would make it really busy work. But what I think we have here, as I'm piecing it together geologically, is a real discrepancy with the standard story. I think we already have very strong evidence that Easter Island, like many of these other sites, it goes back to a much earlier period. Now, yes, some of the Ahus and Moai were reworked. Some of them are later, but I'm talking the origins of the tradition. The origins of people being on the island go back much more than simply, say, 500 AD. I'm talking thousands of years, maybe even back to, if you heard my discussion yesterday, Göbekli Tepe times and Sphinx times. So this is part of the bigger story. Just to refresh your memory, if you were here yesterday or if you missed my talk yesterday, I'm going to refresh you for a few seconds and then I'm going to move on. So the standard paradigm, and I learned this as a graduate student and an undergraduate student, but even at Yale, where I got my Ph.D. in Geology and Geophysics, we were still imbued with the standard paradigm, much of which owes itself to V. Gordon Childe. He espoused the standard paradigm, popularized it, of the origins of species. And as I pointed out yesterday, the standard paradigm is that you go through these fundamental evolutionary stages. You start out as savages, hunters, gatherers, then you sort of evolve toward barbarism in a technical sense, early cultivation, agriculture. The Easter Islanders, as far as most people are concerned, in the popular mind, and when I say popular mind, even the archaeologists, well, they were sort of, maybe they weren't really savages, they were certainly had agriculture and cultivation, but they were basically barbarians, if you would. In a technical sense, they just had little villages. Maybe they were just slowly getting to the point of civilization. Some archaeologists, for instance, dismissed the Rongorongo. They say that's not even Easter Island writing. They say that was like little kids in kindergarten. If you have a little child and they see adults writing, then they try to imitate it. That's the archaeological explanation in some cases. Some archaeologists, some historians say, well, there's no real evidence that the Easter Islanders had any writing before they saw Europeans writing. So they treat them like little kids. Oh, they saw the Europeans, having writing, so they tried to make up writing after that. Some say that, yes, just decorative carving. And going back, one point here is that according to the standard explanation, civilization first arises in Mesopotamia about 3500 BC, does not go any further back. As I discussed yesterday, this is not the standard story. Plato talked about world ages. We've talked about Atlantis here at this conference. There's a long tradition that there were ages before the last round of civilization. There was civilization or civilizations before the last round of civilization. And my early work on the Sphinx denied the standard dating, or did not hold up the standard dating. The standard dating is 3500 BC for the rise of civilization, that the Sphinx was first carved in 2500 BC. As I mentioned yesterday, I first went and worked on these types of issues as a geologist in 1990. That's where the standard paradigm, which is still held by most historians and archaeologists, started to break for me. When I went to study the Sphinx in 1990 with John Anthony West, whom some of you know of. He wrote books like The Serpent in the Sky. One of the, I would say, great early people in now what I'll call this field of alternative work. And the bottom line again, to review a little bit, is that the Sphinx shows evidence of water erosion even though it sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert. And this indicates that it must go back to an earlier period. So we'll tie this back to Easter Island in a second. But again, for those that weren't here, the wind causes scouring of the rock layers. You think of these rocks as sort of like a layer cake, and you get very different erosion from wind than you do with water. And the bottom line is that this put the Sphinx back to an earlier period, pre-civilization. We did seismic work on this, conducted seismic testing, and that too confirmed that the Sphinx goes back to an earlier period based on the quantification I could do, the calibration of the seismic work. And also, a lot of people found this interesting, I think, or when I talk about this, a lot of people do, that possibly the Sphinx was originally a lion and may have actually go back to the age of Leo. It may go back to the age of Leo. Seems to be emerging from the bedrock. The seismic indicated that initially the rump area was connected to the bedrock, and it seemed to be emerging from the bedrock. And if you take this line of evidence, the Sphinx itself maybe goes back 11,000 or more years to the age of Leo. So again, those were things I talked about yesterday. I don't want to dwell on that now, but just to give background information. So Great Sphinx goes back, and people questioned, well, you know, I was heavily criticized in the early 1990s. And as I mentioned yesterday, we now have a new site in Turkey, in southeastern Turkey. That's Göbekli Tepe, that since 1995 has been excavated by Dr. Klaus Schmidt. One name for Göbekli Tepe, and I don't think I mentioned this yesterday, is hill with a navel or belly. What was Easter Island called? The navel of the world, origins. So in both cases, they're thinking in terms of origins. Were these maybe later names? I don't know, but maybe people talked about these as origin points from an earlier civilization. And of course, this, in the case of southeastern Turkey and the area of Göbekli Tepe and Urfa, I mentioned yesterday how Abraham is said to have come there. So again, think in terms of origins and pushing it way back. Again, for those that weren't here yesterday, that's where Göbekli Tepe is. And Göbekli Tepe goes back to a very early period, pushing the edge of the last, and pushing into the end of the last ice age. Just a few pictures of Göbekli Tepe for those that missed it. But this becomes important because we're going to tie it back to Easter Island. And it's really a stunning site. I hope that some of you will come visit it with me this coming summer, next summer. Some of the photographs of the pillars. Notice that these pillars have arms and hands just like the what? Moai on Easter Island. We'll compare that in a minute. And very important, Göbekli Tepe, as we discussed, shows evidence of catastrophe, cataclysm. Notice here that pillar, which was re-erected in ancient times before the entire site was covered over in 10,000 BC. So this is a site that was intentionally buried by 8,000 BC, and as much energy was spent to bury it as to construct it initially, and the question was why. So this is now going to tie several themes together: the Sphinx, Göbekli Tepe, Easter Island. And it was very interesting. Katie and I went to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. We had gone to Easter Island, let me get the chronology right, not that much earlier. So we saw these sites very in our own history. It wasn't that long, and we had both fresh in our mind, and we couldn't help but see that there looked like there were a lot of connections, iconography, in terms of iconography, in terms of style, etc. And I just want to show a few here. For instance, with the hands and the positioning of the hands. And the Moai, yes, they have faces, unlike the pillars at Easter Island, but they're very stylized. They're very, I think, symbolic, if you would. Look at this, my favorite little Moai here, and the fellow from Urfa Man, not technically from Göbekli Tepe, but the same period. I don't know if you can see here, but they have the same positioning of the arms and the hands. Do you see the mouth? No, they don't have a mouth. They don't have lower legs. No, it's not just missing in both cases, but like the other Moai, they were carved without legs. So their torsos, their hands, their arms, they lack a mouth. This has obsidian eyes. This may well have had obsidian eyes because they used those on Easter Island. But they're half a world apart. You have a tradition on Easter Island. These are carved out of wood. These are known as Moai Kava Kava. They're, carvings from wood on Easter Island. Look what you have in Turkey. This happens to be stone because that's what survived. They may have had wooden ones too. But again, I was seeing all these similarities. I throw these out just for your consideration. How about the Easter Island Moai? Remember these top knots or hats? Couldn't help but think of them when we saw the Sufis, the whirling dervishes, and their very distinctive cap. Now, something interesting about the Sufi tradition. Do you know how far back the Sufis claim their tradition goes? They're talking in terms of 20,000 to 30,000 or more years. They claim that their tradition goes back well back into what geologically would be the Ice Age. That they have a very long tradition, that they are not, yes, they sort of adopted Islam, or Islam adopted them. If you know anything about the Sufis, many other Islamic sects, they have persecuted them. They've seen them as non-Islamic, but they themselves claim a tradition that goes back literally tens of thousands of years. Here we have, remember I was talking about the Birdman? Arguably, you have Birdman, not just birds, at Göbekli Tepe. It's been suggested some of these bird-type figures are actually shamanistic, if we could use that term, that they're humans with bird heads. You have these bird motifs on the Rongorongo. And here we have the Rongorongo tablet. This is a detail from the Rongorongo tablet. And here are, I would argue, stylistically very similar types of figures from Turkey, near Göbekli Tepe, again going back to the very, very early period. So what is going on here? How do we tie all of this together? We have to consider the end of the last ice age. Göbekli Tepe, definitely, there's no doubt about it, archaeologically at this point, goes back to the end of the last ice age. I've made the case that the Sphinx, the core body of the Sphinx, the oldest portion, goes back to that period. I believe that as we get more data, that the origins of Easter Island may go back to this remote period. So let's talk about the end of the last ice age for a few minutes. And this is something that I think will dovetail with some of the other presentations we've heard this weekend. End of the last ice age. Technically, I'm a geologist, and I would say technically, based on the best data, which is just within the last few years, end of the last ice age, we can date quite precisely to about 9700 BC. That is Göbekli Tepe time, literally. At that point, there's an incredible warming period. Literally, we snap out of the last ice age, but before that, 1,200 years before that, there is a cold snap, and the period from 10,900 BC to 9,700 BC is known as the Younger Dryas. So that's the Younger Dryas period, and I don't want to bog you down with a lot of details, but some of these details are important because people get confused about them. And I'm not saying just popular audiences, but scientists get confused about them. So everyone knows that we had the last ice age. This was the At the height of the last ice age, just some diagrams showing how there was literally snow and ice cover at high latitudes. Sea levels were lower, and this is the modern world without the ice. So major changes. And at the end of the last ice age, this would be the height of the last ice age, say about 20,000 years ago. Things started to warm up. So this is increasing temperature, but then there was this cold snap. So this is the younger Dryas, when you have this cold snap, and then about 9700 BC, all of a sudden, really dramatic warming. And this dramatic warming is literally like that from a geological point of view. And when I was a graduate student, we said it was a dramatic warming that happened very, very quickly, but we were thinking maybe hundreds of years or 1,000 years. Now, the best evidence, and don't try to read this because I'm just putting it up to show that's good evidence. This is actually in Science, was published in Science, one of the major scientific journals. If you heard my talk yesterday, what was the organization that was persecuting me? American Association for the Advancement of Science, that publishes Science magazine, Science journal. So maybe they're coming around now. Or at least they're publishing things that support my position. And here, right here, it says that the end of the last ice age, this dramatic switch in temperature, happened within 1 to 3 years. Yes, 1 to 3 years. And it turns out that it's simply, when you look at the data, you can't resolve it any to smaller than that. It could have literally been overnight, and we wouldn't be able to tell that was overnight versus 3 years, 1 to 3 years, just because of the resolution of the geologic data. But they're even saying it has to be within 1 to 3 years. Now here's a mistake. But now you understand the mistake. It says, ice age ends smashingly. Did a comet blow up over eastern Canada? And they talk about 12,900 years ago or 10,900 BC. This is in Science News. They should know better. The ice age did not end in 10,900 BC. When did it end? 9,700 BC, remember? 10,900 BC is the beginning of a cold snap just before the end of the last ice age. And yes, in fact, there is evidence for a comet hitting about 10,900 BC, but that would have caused what was a warming trend to get very cold. Everyone with me? Because you would put debris and dust in the atmosphere, it would cause a cooling. So the real question is, and I talk about this actually in my book, Voyages of the Pyramid Builders. I actually hypothesized this, and since then data has come out to support that. But what we have to ask, what we need to address, is not 10,900 BC, so forget about comets ending the last ice age. Yes, there were comets potentially at the end of the last ice age, but not at the very end. You with me? So there could have been a comet or asteroid, something hit that caused a cold snap at 10,900 BC. So this makes it even more dramatic. Why do we have this hot flash, if you would, this warming trend, this snap from very, very cold to very, very warm within 1 to 3 years or less at 9,700 BC, which actually ends the last ice age. What causes that? You know the answer already. I've already alluded to it today. I mentioned it yesterday, and I believe it was the sun. The sun is very volatile. We tend not to realize that. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's not. It has major solar storms. And we've been talking about solar storms in this conference, so this, I believe, ties it right in. But the sun is not stable, as most people believe. It undergoes sometimes major solar outbursts. It ejects what's known as plasma, or charged particles, electrically charged particles. They come in at relativistic speeds, that is close to the speed of light in some cases. They can impact Earth. In some cases, they miss Earth. Is that a good thing? Probably, yeah. But in some cases, they hit the Earth. And the sun goes through periods of stability and periods of instability. A major plasma outburst hitting Earth would cause dramatic, massive destruction on Earth. This would dramatically warm the climate in a snap. It could end an ice age. And I believe that the Greenland ice core data, sediment core data, moon data, all indicate that this is what happened virtually instantaneously 9700 BC to bring us out of the last ice age. I want to develop that for a few minutes here. You can think of pretty plasma hitting. Does plasma hit the atmosphere all the time? Yes. Solar winds, that type of thing. It creates sort of pretty but innocuous things like the mild solar storms, the aurora borealis. But as early as the 1960s, a very brilliant, he's now deceased, astrophysicist at Cornell University, Thomas Gold, suggested that sometimes things are not so calm. And I want to read this quote and comment on it. He said in the early 1960s, and people laughed at him at the time. They said, yes, you're a brilliant man, you've won all these prizes in astronomy, but sometimes you've gone off the deep end. And he said, in the case of a big solar outburst, the Earth's magnetic field could clearly not hold up the incoming gas because the Earth's magnetic field helps protect us. Could not hold up the incoming gas, or that is the plasma, the charged particles, and it would indeed drive down. It would indeed drive down to the atmospheric level, and it would take the form of a series of sparks. Or think of huge, like lightning bolts, but they're not really lightning. They're much more powerful, coming from plasma. And they would burn for extended periods of time and carrying currents of hundreds of millions of amperes. And he talked about how they would cause massive destruction on the surface of the planet. He said one thing you look for is vitrification. This would be vitrification. That is where a massive plasma bolt would hit, sort of like a tornado, hitting certain spots. It could literally melt the rock on the surface, which would then, flash melt and then solidify again. And he suggested you should find, if this scenario is true, find vitrification. So this is one thing I've looked for. Don't try to read all this, I'm just putting it up. But have you heard of vitrification? At ancient sites, it exists. Real, genuine vitrification. One place it exists is in the so-called forts of Scotland, or the early fortifications. I'll read one thing here. This is 1898. Vitrification in a fort is understood to mean the binding together of the stone by vitreous material. What is vitreous material? It's basically glass. When you melt rock and it solidifies again, it forms glass. Produced by the action of heat, etc. Now, where would this heat come from? I submit a major solar storm with these huge sort of lightning-type bolts would cause localized vitrification. And we can see this. For instance, this is known as the Moat of Mark in Scotland. There's a location from Google, and if you go there, it's one of these. It's considered a Dark Age fort, but there's actually evidence that goes back 10,000 years or more, and that's published by the Scotland Museum. So this is not something I'm just making up or saying on my own basis. Here's the fort, not very impressive. It's all overgrown, etc. We'll go up to it. They're still not very impressive. There's some of the walls. Impressive? Nah, probably not. There, I don't know. If you don't know what you're looking at, you might not think that's very impressive. When I saw that, I was incredibly excited. Why? I'm a geologist. I was so happy. There I am. Because what I have in my hands, that is vitrification. That is absolutely vitrification. Do you see? It doesn't look pretty, maybe. But do you see what's happened here? This is clear evidence of incredibly intense heat, thousands of degrees centigrade, that hit this rock made it basically boil and bubble. Do you see that? And then solidify again. This is the type of thing you would be looking at. There's my centimeter for scale, and here it is without. This is true vitrification. Do you see how it forms sort of bubbles that solidified again? And when you look at these so-called forts, you can actually see that, okay, only certain sides are vitrified, only the top is vitrified. You can actually figure out the direction that it came from above. It's incredible. So I submit that these ice cores, the sediment cores, ancient vitrification, all of this is additional evidence for a solar outburst at the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 BC, roughly, 9,700 BC precisely. Plus there's more evidence, and this brings us back in a few minutes to Easter Island. There's the petroglyphs. We heard about some petroglyphs earlier today. Very, very interesting. There's lots of different petroglyphs. There's modern petroglyphs. There's ancient petroglyphs. And then there are really ancient petroglyphs that go back, I would contend, 12,000 years. Someone who has studied these petroglyphs in great detail is a colleague. I first met him, I believe, at a conference in the year 2000. His name is Anthony Perrott, Dr. Anthony Perrott. He's a plasma physicist. That's what his Ph.D. is in. He studies plasma discharges from the sun, from other stars, between planets. Here's just a picture of plasma. Have you ever seen plasma? Absolutely, you've seen plasma. A candle technically is plasma, burning. Plasma fluorescent tubes, lights, that's technically plasma. But we're talking really highly charged, balls of plasma coming off a sun or a star. That's what he studies. He found in his studies that plasma, very intense plasma outbursts, take on certain forms. They take on forms that look like this. They look like what? Does that sort of look like a person? Yeah. And he, just as a hobby, started looking at petroglyphs, and lo and behold, he found that these ancient petroglyphs, not all petroglyphs, but these very ancient class of petroglyphs, sure looks like the plasma formations he'd been studying for decades. They're taking on the same shapes. And one thing I'll point out, for instance, doesn't it sort of look like a little man? Stick figure, but it has these weird things on the sides of its body. People don't normally have that, I guess, unless they're, I don't know, they carry their donuts with them. And, they don't necessarily have genitalia that long, or I don't want to be vulgar. But you can think of the northern southern lights, and if they were much more intense by orders of magnitude from plasma hitting, they would take on these forms. I talk about in Forgotten Civilization, I won't go into detail now, but there was something known as the Carrington event in 1859 when a small coronal mass ejection, a ball of plasma, hit Earth. So this was 1859, and people talked about seeing stick figures like this dancing in the sky. Yeah, they're just what he's talking about. So we have this, and he started looking for this. So he said, not just in Arizona, not just around Los Alamos, but he and his colleagues started looking around the world, and they have found similar types of figures in over 130 countries. And they all take on these diagnostic, distinctive forms. So again, this is one of the classic ones. It looks like a human with little balls on the side or little forms on the side. Here are some of his major forms. He distinguishes certain types, stick figures with dots on their side, stick figures with what heads? Bird heads, bird-headed men. Common theme, we saw that at Easter Island, you see that around the world. I started my work on ancient cultures, as you know, in Egypt. What's one of the common motifs? Bird-headed men. Horus, the falcon, but often takes a human body with a falcon's head, or the ibis head on a human body, etc. You've seen examples of that just today. Does it go back to something like this? Are the cascading donut-like cylindrical shapes? So these very distinctive features, and you find them around the world. Here's some examples from Dr. Perrott, everywhere from Arizona, where we are, to Spain and Saudi Arabia, all kinds of weird versions. But again, you get certain distinctive features, as he points out, like these dots on the sides, or extra pairs of arms, that type of thing, which all, in his interpretation, and I agree with him, would be what you would see if you were looking at plasma in the sky. So to be clear, he's not saying that the plasma came down and engraved this on the rocks. People were looking at the sky and drawing what they saw in these tumultuous times when the plasma was occurring. Here's some more pictures, again from the UAE and from Saudi Arabia. You find them around the world. Here's some Arizona and Saudi Arabia again. So very, very interesting. He's published this in refereed journals, scientific journals with his colleagues. He's talked about the what he calls a high current Z-pinch aurora, very technical way of saying a major plasma outburst from the sun. And he's talked about how the plasma would come in from the sun. It would come in certain directions. He has been able to map these directions, how it would come in, how it would flow in. And lo and behold, among other things, he has actually looked, as we have, at Easter Island and pointed out that a lot of the petroglyphs on Easter Island are oriented the correct way for people to have been looking up in the sky and seeing things in the sky and then drawing them, if that makes sense. And what do we have on Easter Island? Not just petroglyphs, but the Rongorongo script. So we're looking at this. When I say we, Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, and myself, we're looking at this. We're trying to put things together. She, and I give her credit for this, she pointed out to me that we're puzzling over the Rongorongo, but when you start looking at these, they sure look like the plasma petroglyphs. In fact, a lot of them are very dead ringers, as you might say, for plasma configurations, as Dr. Perrott has reconstructed in the petroglyphs he was looking at. So Katie started comparing them, and I started comparing them. She put this together. For instance, the distinct different plasma shapes. Here are some of the what he calls pinch instabilities in the plasma columns, sort of turns into humans with bird heads, some of the petroglyphs, and the Rongorongo, which is very similar. Look at this. Here are some of the sort of stick figure type ones, and the petroglyphs, so plasma, petroglyphs, these are various computer simulations. Look at this. These are actual experimental data. Look at the Rongorongo. Isn't it very similar? Were the Rongorongo, were the Easter Islanders doing plasma physics on Easter Island, or were they looking up at the sky to see the natural plasma phenomena? Here's Rongorongo again compared. Here, I love this one, because here's the plasma configurations. Here are some of the petroglyphs around the world. Here's Rongorongo. Look how similar those are. The Rongorongo, I think, is even more similar in many cases than some of the, we'll call it, cruder petroglyphs around the world. I don't have time to digress too much into other things, but have people heard of the Nazca lines and the Nazca glyphs? I think this is part of the story. Here's some of the Nazca glyphs compared to Rongorongo glyphs. And here's an Easter Island. I don't know if you saw that in one of the other photographs, but they have pairs of hands, among other things. I know one person, we know one physicist who saw some very strong plasma phenomena, some very strong northern lights, and he described how some of it looked like hands in the sky when he was at very high latitudes and had the opportunity to see that. On Easter Island, this is one of the indigenous legends. This came from an ethnologist in 1963, so this was long before I'm thinking about plasma. I just want to make it clear that someone's not making this up to please me. And he recorded that one of the indigenous names for Easter Island was not just the navel of the world, but Matakaterani, I can't pronounce it, which translates as eyes gazing at the sky. Remember I talked about the Moai looking up? Gazing at the sky. And one of their legends in translation is in the days of Roko Hitau, that was one of the kings, legendary kings or founders, the sky fell from above onto the earth. I can interpret that. I think a valid interpretation is that is plasma coming down. Something's coming down from the sky. The people cried out, the sky has fallen in the days of King Roko Hitau. He took hold. He waited a given time. He's a politician, right? The sky returned. It went away and it stayed up there. And I'm sure he took credit for, fixing the problem. But think about it. I think these guys were looking up at the sky for good reason. I think this is part of, why they were important. Maybe a warning, maybe, commemorating something, that they went through. I believe that this is what we see in the Rongorongo. So were they looking at something very severe? Again, this is just to give you a feel for it. This is modern aurora borealis, but it would have been much more than that. Getting back to Perrot and his colleagues. Again, they published on this. This is one of their papers. Evidence for an intense solar outburst in prehistory. I agree. Lots of evidence for intense solar outbursts. They very carefully avoid the issue of when it occurred. When did it occur? So what is the date on it? They avoid the issue. I submit that all the evidence indicates this intense solar outburst is what ended the last ice age, 9700 BC, knocked out these early civilizations, basically put us back into a dark age, if you would, or put humanity into a dark age. And it's what ended Göbekli Tepe, Great Sphinx. It's recorded on the Rongorongo. Now, just to be clear, and I talk about this in Forgotten Civilization, my book, maybe the Rongorongo was later used for more mundane purposes, once you have a script, but of the few surviving tablets, and there's only about 26 that survived, the missionaries and all that type of thing, because they were burning them en masse. Does that sound familiar? Christianize and get rid of all the pagan stuff. There's incredible repetition between them, so I think they were recording essentially the same thing, something very important, and they may have essentially been a scientific text, if you would, recording what was happening in the skies in terms of coronal mass ejections, things ejected from the corona of the sun, these solar outbursts, something that technically would be known as a solar proton event. I talk about this in the book. And orders of magnitude above anything which has occurred in recent history. The biggest one being the Carrington event, a major solar outburst in 1859. We say major, but it would have been very minor from an astrophysical point of view. As a side note, at that time in 1859, there wasn't much in the way of electronics or electricity, but there were telegraph lines. They were absolutely fried. If we had a Carrington event today, we wouldn't be talking right now. All the electricity would go out, communications would go down. It would be very, very severe. So I think this major solar outburst ended the last ice age. It would have melted the glaciers. It would have raised sea levels. It would have set off cataclysmic changes. And, it would have been an incredible situation. And it probably caused the water that, could have eroded the Sphinx. You would have had major precipitation. As you melted glaciers, you evaporated water from oceans and lakes, and it has to come down again. So there would have been floods and deluges. You came back to this, our timeline. So I think this is what ended it. Came back to things like Göbekli Tepe. They covered it over. Why did they cover it over? Why were they trying to protect it? I think because because of these cataclysms that were going on at the end of the last ice age. And where would they go? They had to take shelter in thick stone buildings. They had to go underground. They had to go into caves. Does this sound familiar from Easter Island? Yeah, how they went into caves. Remember these guys? These shelters. And even if some of these are later, think about what did we do during the Cold War, and I'm afraid we may be going back into a Cold War. People had bunkers in their backyards. You know, if your ancestors had experienced this once, might you have a concept it could happen again? And you better be prepared. So even if some of these are proven to be a bit later, I think, you know, it's part of the memory. And we have around the world a tradition of going underground at a very early period. A lot of archaeologists, standard archaeologists, have asked, why do these ancient sites, why did they spend this time to carve and to go deep underground? It makes no sense. Well, yes, I think it does make sense if you have this in your past history. I mentioned Cappadocia, I think yesterday, where you have literal underground cities carving in the rocks. If you come with me, we'll go into one of them. This is Kamakali, and you go underground. This is the modern entrance to it. But it's incredible to go down there. And this particular one is 8 or more stories deep. It's beautifully constructed. I mean, this is high technology, the way it's constructed with great ventilation, extremely sophisticated. And yes, they'll tell you how it was used 2,000 years ago, or it was used in Byzantine times 1,000 years ago. But I think a lot of these are much older structures and they're being used and reused again. There we go down into it just to give you a sense of this. And after this cataclysm, I think we went into a major dark age. So I showed this briefly yesterday, I think. This is, for instance, Çatalhöyük, which goes back about 2,000 years or so after Göbekli Tepe. This is maybe 6,000 BC, but this was during what I consider a dark age after the demise of that earlier civilization at the end of the last ice age. Here we have very simple mud brick versus major stonework. So civilization seems to be in a major decline. So to summarize, and then I want to make a few more comments as to the future, all the evidence suggests in my mind that there was a major cataclysmic event in about 9700 BC. This ended the last ice age, and it wiped out, I'll put it that way, the advanced and now forgotten civilizations, or all but forgotten civilizations that had arisen by the end of the last ice age. And we went into a dark age, we went into a major decline. So what could the future hold? I want to address that briefly. And where are we now? Could a major solar outburst happen again? Remember Thomas Gold, astrophysicist? I quoted before. He suggested that a major plasma event might hit about every 10,000 years. If that's the case, we're overdue. Not to scare you, but there's more data. Look at this. Solar activity instability at present is the highest it's been since the end of the last ice age. This is based on isotope data, which is a proxy. I won't go into the details now, but a proxy for solar activity. Notice at the end of the last ice age, this is at the end of the last ice age, so this is thousands of years moving up to the present. The sun was very active at times, went into lulls, very erratic. Do you see that? Very, very erratic with solar outbursts, and it would calm down, another solar outburst, calm down. And then since then, it calmed down, the sun sort of got calmer and calmer, and for the last few thousand years, it's been very calm until very what? Recently. And we're now going into, I believe, a period of incredible solar activity again. You've heard about this from some of the other speakers, and beware. Some people will say, oh, all of a sudden the sun is going dormant and it's becoming very quiet. You may have heard that. Yes, in the very short term, that may be the case, but at the end of the last ice age, you had high activity, then it would sink down to almost nothing, then it would explode again. So I would say beware. We are going, I think, into a period of real instability. So beware. Bottom line, though, I think that we have an incredible amount of evidence now between what I was discussing yesterday and today, that civilization, there was civilization much earlier than the traditional beginning of civilization going back to the end of the last ice age. And I don't think we should be surprised at this recent data, because after all, the ancients said the same thing all along. So again, I come back to one of my heroes, Plato, and he talked about Atlantis. We've been talking about Atlanteans at this conference. And, you know, that Atlantis, according to Plato, when did it collapse? He says about 9600 BC. I'll give him 100 years. That is essentially the end of the last ice age. I think the timing could, you know, it's almost exact. You know, he talked in rough terms, and when you turn those rough terms into our calendar, you get 9600 BC compared to 9700 BC based on the most recent geological data. A lot of people actually will still talk about 9500 BC for the end of the last ice age, although the best data now, I think, pushes it back a couple of years. But what do we have here? There's ancient traditions of cycles of civilization, not just Atlantis, but earlier cycles of civilization. One of the classic versions of this is the Hindu Yuga cycle, or we have in the Western tradition the gold, silver, bronze, and iron age, and then you cycle back again. You have the precessional cycle, the age of Aries, the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius. But the concept that we go through cycles, we go through different levels of consciousness, if you would, collectively. We go through different levels of technology. And I think that the data is now indicating this may be the case. Back at the end of the last ice age, arguably before the end, we're in a golden age. Some people will argue that was a golden age, that then we went into a decline, that for the last some thousands of years, we may have been going through a descending cycle. If you think of the Yuga cycle, and we're starting to, I hope, ascend now. We're starting to come back out of it and come back up to it. But I think there's still going to be rough times. There's going to be tough times. And just a few more quick comments, because I think it ties in with other people's work. Different levels of consciousness. The ancients talked about different levels of consciousness dominating different ages. And I think these are tied in with real changes on Earth. And a lot of this ties in with things we've been talking about, like electromagnetic radiation. So we have electromagnetic radiation in the Earth's atmosphere bouncing around between the ground and the ionosphere. You can think of this as energy waves or radio waves, instigated in large part by the sun and energy coming in. One of the primary ones you've heard about are the what? The Schumann resonances. Sometimes these are very extremely long wavelength, extremely low frequency, or ELF waves that resonate around the Earth. We are naturally attuned to them. Some people talk about this as the heartbeat of the Earth, the fundamental heartbeat of the Earth. I think many of you are familiar with them. They have various frequencies. Classic Schumann resonances are things like 7.8 or so hertz cycles per second, 14, 21, 26. And lo and behold, this is not coincidental, we've heard a little bit about brain waves in earlier talks. So you have your alpha waves and your beta waves and your theta waves and your delta waves. And these tie in terms of frequency with, guess what? The Schumann frequencies, the Schumann resonances. Experimentally, we know now that Humans are very sensitive to these ELFs. Extremely low frequency, long wavelength, Schumann resonances. You can talk about how the Schumann resonances dovetail with the different brainwave frequencies. Something that happens, whether it's HAARP artificially altering this or solar activity, this has a real effect on us, I submit, I believe. And this is someone I actually studied under Fairbridge. He's now deceased. This is from a paper in his honor. And he pointed out, he's a very good geophysicist, and he pointed out that the planets, the sun, the solar system, they all resonate together. They all affect each other. They affect the ionosphere. They affect the Schumann resonances. And this is down to the atomic level, literally. Now, this should not be the case. Evidence for correlations between nuclear decay rates and Earth-Sun distance. Everyone knows what nuclear decay rates are? The class, okay, think of something that is radioactive. It falls apart, it degrades, it decays, and it has a half-life. Okay, and that half-life is supposed to be conductivity. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of slides. This is someone I was interested to hear. He was mentioned before. I put this in before I got here. How many people have heard of the Theosophers? Yeah, Charles Webster Leadbeater. And I love this quote from him. It is one of the commonest of our mistakes to consider that the limit of our power of perception is also the limit of all there is to perceive. Because how many people dismiss things if they can't see it, if they can't feel it? And in fact, in many cases, I would suggest their paradigm, their worldview doesn't allow them to feel it. That doesn't mean it isn't real, it isn't there. So I think that we are much more connected. I'm sure many of you feel this way. We're tethered to each other. We're part of the cosmos. Our vibrations, if I could use that term, resonate throughout the universe. We affect each other. And tying in with the theme of this weekend, I think we need to figure out how to protect ourselves, how to save the planet. We need to be a piece of it. And we need to be, I'll use the term earth keepers, active earth keepers. And one thing I do, a few little plugs if I could, come travel. You need to experience the world. I tell my students and other people all the time, you can't understand things if you haven't had the actual experiences. So if you'd like to come on some of the trips, that would be great that I do or we're going to be doing together. I mentioned last time Oracle. We're setting up a new not-for-profit organization to really look into these things if you're interested in that. And final plug for myself in the book. I've rushed through a lot of things. I go into a lot more detail in my latest book, including in the last chapter in particular, a lot of what we'll call the science and the sacred and the spiritual tying together. And I firmly believe that it's not just sort of voyeuristic to study these ancient cultures, but we have a lot to learn from them. I think they knew a lot of things that we have to relearn. So I encourage you to look into all of this. Go to my website for more information. And if you'd like to be, go to my website for more information. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list, this is actually my wife, Katie Ulysses. That's her Gmail account. Send her a note. And I hope you will just pursue all of this. I think the information is very important. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.